All right, in this video, we'll be looking at how muscles work. I called it Muscle Mechanics 1, but there's no Muscle Mechanics 2 because I kind of rethought things, but I'm just going to leave the title as is. All right, so we'll be first just a general overview and then getting into the specifics. And so muscle contraction, basically the way that it works, nerves integrate with your muscle fibers, and there's an electrical impulse that travels into the muscle fiber and it causes those muscles to contract. That is a very general overview. The way that this works is by those filaments, those actin and myosin filaments, slide past one another, and thus this is called the sliding filament model for contraction. The filaments don't actually change in length, they just overlap past each other, and it causes the whole muscle to grow contracted or shorter. And so you can see here the steps of that. We're going to be truncating this quite a bit as we move through this, just kind of hitting the high points. This is a very deep rabbit hole, but we're just going to kind of, again, hit the high points with it. So the first part to look at is what's happening at the neuromuscular junction. If you look at that word, neuromuscular, it has to do with nerves and muscles. This is where the nerve and the muscle fiber meets. Every muscle fiber is innervated, and so this is happening at each muscle fiber to cause this kind of reaction. And so the first thing that happens is the action potential, which is basically the nerve impulse, arrives at the axon terminal, which is right here at the end, the very end of the nerve cell. And that causes a release of this neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. You see it written here, ACH, a bunch, which is fine with me to abbreviate it that, but it's called acetylcholine. And this neurotransmitter is released and it diffuses across the axon or across this space, which is called the synapse. And it diffuses across that space, causes an action potential on the nerve cell or on the muscle cell itself, and then that muscle cell is going to have the same action potential, the same electrical impulse, and it's going to travel down the cell membrane until it reaches a T tubule. And in that T tubule, it's going to travel to the inside of the cell. And so here you see that. This is the cell membrane for the muscle cell. It gets to this T tubule, which is kind of like a wire that goes to the inside, and it's going to turn on these specialized endoplasmic reticulum called sarcoplasmic reticulum, or just SR for short. Those sarcoplasmic reticulum then release calcium into the muscle cell. And so just to review, action potential gets to the muscle cell. The muscle cell is then, or the acetylcholine is released into the synapse. That causes an action potential on the muscle cell itself, which travels down the T tubule and causes the sarcoplasmic reticulum to be activated, and then it releases calcium into the cell. All right. That calcium is then going to initiate something that's called a cross-bridge cycling, which is this interaction between the myosin filament and the actin filament. Remember, the myosin filaments are called thick filaments. The actin filaments are called thin filaments. So a couple things here before we go on. When there's no calcium in the cell, there is this molecule called troponin. And troponin is where calcium binds to. And if there's no calcium, then this troponin is not activated, which causes this thread here. You can see this thread that is blocking those little holes. This thread is called tropomyosin. And those little holes are called myosin binding sites. And so if you can imagine, if you've ever climbed on a rock wall, those myosin binding sites are almost like the little handholds for the rock wall. If you go to the rock wall after hours, those holes are covered so that you cannot climb the wall when no one's there. the coverings of those holes is like the tropomyosin, and the troponin is like the lock that keeps all those things covered. To unlock that troponin, you need calcium. And so when the sarcoplasmic reticulum releases calcium into the cell, those calciums then bind with the troponin. That causes this tropomyosin to roll off those myosin binding sites, as you see here, and opens them up. And then guess what happens? Myosin binds to them. When myosin binds to them, it causes this bridge here, which causes myosin to pull on actin. And when myosin pulls on actin, it causes the whole sarcomere to grow closer to one another. And so if I can demonstrate, so here's your myosin filaments here, and here's the actin filaments. And what happens, this is when they're normally at rest, and these myosin filaments, the red ones, are going to pull those actin filaments toward one another. So then what occurs is they get closer. I'm going to have to pull each one of these separate, but I think it'll show you this whole thing is going to come closer together. And if you can multiply that times, millions, every one of those little sarcomeres is going to get shorter, causing the whole muscle to contract. And so just to review, and that's going to be with us now. Let's see if I can get rid of it. Well, I'll just have to leave it there now. It's okay. All right. So just to review, calcium binds to troponin. That causes the tropomyosin, this thread, to roll off those myosin binding sites, which allows myosin to bind and pull that actin toward each other, causing the entire muscle to shorten. It's just bothering me. All right, so let's talk a little bit about muscle contraction in general. A couple things. Each fiber is contracting, but those same principles apply to the whole muscle because the muscle acts as one unit. And so contraction may or may not shorten the actual muscle length depending on the amount of force that is on the other side as well. And so there's two types of contractions. There's isotonic contraction, which is where the muscle shortens because the tension exceeds the load. This is basically like, think of it as I can lift 3 kilograms. Therefore, when I attempt to lift it, my muscle shortens and it causes me to lift that. An isometric contraction is when the load is too heavy. My muscles are still contracting. They're still trying to work, but they're unable to shorten because the tension isn't as much as the load that I'm able to do. And so depending on the response that your brain sends to the muscle, it may or may not lift that. It's kind of like when you lift a pencil up off the desk, you only need a little bit of force because your brain has decided that's how much a pencil weighs. Maybe you've done this before where you've looked at something and you thought it was heavier than it was, and then when you went to lift it, you actually kind of jumped. Well, that jump is your brain thinking that's heavy, you need this much tension, and it kind of decides that ahead of time, and it puts amount of force into that, and since it was lighter than you supposed it was, it causes you to jump. Or you've had the opposite thing happen where something was heavier than you thought it was, and it causes you to not have very much force, and you can actually injure yourself that way. And so that force and duration of contraction will vary in response to the stimuli that your brain is giving it. And a couple things before we talk about exercise, just to add to this. Each muscle is served by at least one nerve, more than one nerve oftentimes. And those axons can branch into lots of different terminals, and what that can cause is a muscle can then contract in different ways and different intensities. And so when you are learning to lift weights, for instance, and you're learning to lift heavier weight, what ends up happening is your muscles do get bigger as a result of this, and they train. We'll talk about that in a second. But your brain also has to know that you can lift that much weight too. And so being able to lift heavier weight isn't so much a function of your muscles getting bigger, but your brain understanding that you can do that. And so oftentimes people who, for instance, work doing manual labor can just come in and be really strong and are stronger than a person who just goes to the gym, because the person who does manual labor is familiar with lifting different weights and knows how to use their body more. And so that you can take someone who doesn't look particularly strong because they're not built up with a lot of muscles, and they can be oftentimes stronger than someone who has a lot of muscle mass because it's a central nervous system function. All right, so let's talk about how the muscles respond to exercise. There are two different kinds of exercise. There's aerobic exercise and anaerobic exercise, or resistance exercise. Aerobic exercise is like jogging, can be swimming, something that's lighter. This is what this does is it builds increased capillaries in the muscles. It increases the number of mitochondria that are going to be located in the muscle cells. And the reason this is because aerobic exercise is oxygen exercise. Aerobic means oxygen. And so you are going to build up more things that have to do with oxygen consumption. Your capillaries go into the muscles, bring more oxygen to the muscles. The mitochondria use oxygen in cellular respiration. This is going to result in greater endurance and resistance to fatigue. Resistance exercise, on the other hand, which is typically anaerobic, meaning that the muscles don't have enough oxygen, this is going to lead to the size of your muscles getting bigger. And the reason that is because the muscles are having to repair themselves. And when they repair themselves in such a way to prepare themselves for the next time that you're going to lift heavy weight. And it's a body's response to doing that. And so basically what happens with this is the muscle increases in size because the individual muscle fibers increase in size as well. You're still going to get the increase of mitochondria. You're going to get an increase in glycogen stores. Your connective tissue is going to grow stronger. And so if you increase muscle at the right way, in the right way, and at the right frequency, then your connective tissue will catch up with that. What people have trouble with, they take steroids, for instance, the connective tissue doesn't keep up with the muscle mass, and you can have tears and that sort of thing. A couple other things that I need to mention. Muscle tone is, we're all familiar with muscle tone. Muscle tone has to do with when your muscles are slightly contracted at all time. When you look at someone's arm and it looks muscular, like the girl in this picture, for instance, it's because her muscles are just slightly contracted a lot of the times. This has to do with the central nervous system, again, being ready to respond. This keeps the muscles healthy. It allows them being able to respond. Typically, people who use their muscles more frequently have tone to them. Those that don't, do not, because if the body doesn't use the muscles, it's not going to expand energy or expend energy in order to keep them toned. And so just use is what will tone your muscles, just being able to use them. I did talk about being able to lift different weights and what that means. I'll kind of go back to this picture. The term for that, and it's a term that you need to be familiar with, is called recruitment. And this has to do with how many muscle fibers are used. When you pick up that pencil, you don't need very much. So you're recruiting very few muscle fibers. However, when you go to lift 100 pounds, you're going to have to recruit a lot more. And your brain kind of decides that ahead of time. And so changing the way that you look at weight, or if you decide, okay, I'm going to start getting stronger, your brain will start to rewire itself, and the way that it talks to your muscles so that it's able to recruit more and more muscle fibers to do the increased amount of work.